As I got another rhyme, another rhythm for y'all to listen. I'm never quitting on my mission, I'ma roll with what I'm giving. Got some ambition, this new edition, filling positions. Looking at the void in myself and feeling what's missing. Better watch the way you going, better go in the right direction. Don't make you stressing, but you gon' be counting blessings. And I know that for certain, keep on working, open curtains. Haters swerving, cause they ain't ready for your final version. Whoa. I'm never gon' give up, fall down, I just gotta get up, yeah.
You're listening to the Tom Ficklin Show on WNHH-LP 103.5 FM, your home for community radio.
Good morning and welcome to the Tom Ficklin Show. My name is Georgia Goldburn and I am the director of Hope for New Haven, a nonprofit that manages the Hope Child Development Center located at 81 Olive Street. I'm also the co-founder of Circle, a network of childcare providers serving children and families of color in the greater New Haven, Bridgeport, Stamford, and Stratford area. Once again, I would like to take an opportunity to thank Tom Ficklin for allowing me to host this show in his absence. We will continue our conversation and our examination of how America's childcare crisis evolved from legislation and policies shaped in racial animus and how that has shaped Connecticut early care system and our plans to fix it. Joining me today, I have Meryl Gay, the Executive Director of the Connecticut Early Childhood Alliance. The Connecticut Early Childcare Alliance is a statewide organization that was founded in 2002 that's committed to improving learning, health, safety, and economic security outcomes for children ages birth to 8. The goal is for all children in Connecticut to enter kindergarten healthy, eager to learn, and ready for school success. Its guiding vision is that families have strategies and capacity for early care and education so that each child is supported by comprehensive and interconnected services, including early learning, nutrition, and social, emotional, and physical health. Joining me as well is Eva Bermudez Zimmerman. Eva is the Coalition Director, your title, the Coalition Director for Childcare for Connecticut Future, which is a coalition of parents, providers, and advocates dedicated to transforming the broken childcare system in the state. As a coalition, their vision is to fix childcare, the workforce needs, sustainable wages with benefits, and families shouldn't have to pay more than 7% of their annual income. An equitable system has to be built for everyone, not a select few. Together, they are driving to change this broken system now. So welcome, Eva. Welcome, Meryl. And thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us. So exciting.
Yes. So before we jump into the questions, and I want to share that Eva and Meryl and I are often in the trenches together, working and battling. And so we are going to, I know that you guys know the full history of the childcare crisis, but what I want to do is ground people, our listeners, in some of the history of what's happening so that they can understand the complexity of the problem and understand the conversation that we're going to have. So today I've decided to take an excerpt from Dr. Sonia Michelle from the University of Maryland, writing about the history of childcare. And I'm just going to read her introduction, and then I would like for you guys to respond, and then we are going to jump into questions. In the United States today, most mothers of preschool and school-age children are employed outside the home. American mothers have invented many ways to care for their children while they work. Native Americans strapped newborns to cradle boards or carried them in woven slings. Colonial women placed small children in standing stools or gojins to prevent them from falling into fireplace. Pioneers on the Midwestern plains laid infants in wooden boxes fastened to the beams of their plows. Southern dirt farmers tethered their runabouts to pegs driven into the soil at the edge of their fields. White Southern planters' wives watched African-American boys and girls playing in the kitchen yard while their mothers toiled in the cotton fields. African-American mothers sang white babies to sleep while their own little ones comforted themselves. Migrant laborers shaded infants in baby tents set in the midst of the beet fields. Cannery workers put children to work besides them, stringing beans and shelling peas. Shellfish processors sent toddlers to play on the docks, warning them not to go near the water. Mothers have left children alone in cradles and cribs and have locked them in tenement flats and cars parked in factory lots. They have taken them to parents, grandparents, comadres, playmothers, neighbors, and strangers. They have sent them out to play with little mothers, siblings sometimes only a year or two older. They have enrolled them in summer camps and recreation programs, taken them to baby farms, given them up to orphanages and foster homes, and surrendered them for indenture. They have taken them to family daycare providers and left them at home with babysitters, nannies, and nursemaids, some of them undocumented workers. Mothers have dropped off infants and youngsters at preschool facilities of various size and quality, dressed in tatters with smudged cheeks and stringy hair, and picked them up garbed in starched smocks, rosy cheeks, smelling of soap. Some have been turned away because they've had fevers, runny noses, or lice. Mothers have left their jobs in the middle of the day to pick up children with ear infections, chicken pox, temper tantrums. They have parked their offsprings who are howling, whimpering, whispering in the corner with friends, and found them later giggling, hungry, cranky, half asleep. They have walked out feeling guilty, sad, anxious, fearful, with their hearts in their mouth, without a care in the world. Mothers have left babies dozing in carriages, parked outside movie palaces, at department stores, daycare nurseries, and parking services in bowling alleys and shopping mall. Some mothers have placed their children in the care of others and have never come back. At the end of the 19th century, then American childcare have come to consist of a range of formal and informal provisions that were generally associated with poor, minority, and immigrants and were stigmatized as charitable and custodial. So when I read that, it just really rooted me in the crisis and how the more things change, the more things stays the same. And I would just like for you just to give your thoughts on what was just read and just the history and what you are experiencing as advocate in this work.
So I'll go first. We live in a market economy, and what that means is that people who have the resources can get what they want, and other people are left to their own devices. And that's the case when it's talking about buying food or buying childcare or buying healthcare, all of those things. What we have is a very fragmented patchwork that parents are trying to make do with the best they can, finding a spot if they're lucky, and trying to afford it. And it's kind of a mess.
Yeah, and it was a mess then, and it's a mess still now.
Yeah.
Eva.
What I would add is what's even more disappointing in the reality between her comments and her experience, just analyzing the past and comparing it to the future, is that now we have science, we have research that proves and shows to us that 0 to 5, this very delicate age, is extremely important in the cultivation, education, transformation, and creation of this child, of this mind that is so malleable. And we have that science, but the science is not giving us the authority to make it a wake-up call for politicians and people to do something. So that's even worse, I would say. Back then, in all of these examples, pioneer women, working women, the creation of women in the workforce, you could use the excuse of racism. You can use the excuse, it's not an excuse, but one could say it's an excuse, right? Of racism being the reason why their child was marginalized, or women and bias being the reason why that child was not being cared for, desperation, poverty. And all of those things were not proven scientifically to say, well, it's important that you should do better for your child. And now it is. And yet we still see mothers and we still see educators being forgotten in the process.
So one of the things, Eva, and I love the way that you have framed that. Well, one of the thing that we've seen, and this has occurred throughout history, where there is this renewed interest in childcare. We know during World War II, there was this heightened awareness that women needed to be in the workforce to support the war effort. And so there was lots of work done there to provide universal childcare. It was the only time in American history that has occurred. And we know in the 50s, in the 70s, there was a huge opportunity for us to also have universal childcare with the expansion of the Head Start program. And that was, vetoed by, it was supported bicamerally, bipartisanly, and it was vetoed by Nixon. But we have a renewed conversation now. The childcare crisis has actually come up once again in the national discourse. And can you explain to the audience here, what are some of the factors that have led to this renewed recognition of the childcare crisis? And how has the role of advocacy been in raising awareness and pushing for policy change?
I'll connect it to Meryl's comment just now about the economy and the open market. The difference now of that renewed interest is COVID-19. There was a pandemic where a very large group of people, state by state, including the state of Connecticut, were not able to go to work, while others had to go to work but didn't have the ability to do so because they had a child at home and they couldn't find care. In this pandemic, often people who were referring to childcare during that health crisis would say, well, childcare is now, they would use the word now in crisis, not realizing, and like you said, Miss Georgia, we are in the trenches together, not realizing that the crisis has been ongoing, that the crisis has not been remedied, it's only been perpetuated. So the market is giving us a spotlight, a very unique moment where people who drive this economy, manage it, business owners, politicians, people in authority, have finally taken a step back and connected the dots between the everyday person who needs childcare and its impact of not having quality and accessible care to the economy. And that's very unique. It's very unique because even though COVID-19 is more controlled now, despite the health efforts that we've overcome, we have not made those same strides in overcoming the childcare crisis. The economy still is seeing stagnation due to that very clear connection to not having accessible childcare.
So I'm going to challenge you a little bit, Eva, on this point. Because you said we are in a unique place, and it doesn't feel very unique to me, because it felt like the last time we had this awareness of the childcare crisis was to address the needs of men. We needed to go to war, and the men were away at war, and we had to continue with the economy. And so women were called up to keep the economy going. And it feels again like, from your description, that the heightened awareness and the national discourse is once again driven by the needs of men. So how would you say this time is different, and that the conversation will continue, or there will be any change once the needs of men are met. And when I'm saying men, it's not in a pejorative way, but it's just to kind of recognize that, the folks that you're talking about, again, are predominantly men, and the industries that rely on the childcare system to continue to grow and to thrive are led generally by men. And so then do you accept my challenge that this situation is not as unique? And I'm going to give you an opportunity, Meryl, as the male in this room, to respond. But I want to just challenge Eva a bit on that.
I'll accept it. I'll accept it, and I will answer your first question as well about advocacy, because I didn't answer it. So I'll answer both questions by saying that the unique opportunity now really depends on how we, the advocate, the parent, the mother, the father, decide to react to this spotlight. So if we were in if we were in an eclipse, that's a more recent event that happened, and we were watching the eclipse with our own eyes, it'd be very hard to try to notice what was happening in the sky, and you could really do damage to your eyes, right? But if we watch that eclipse with the special glasses, we can see it clearly and analyze it and enjoy it. And I feel right now, using that analogy, we know that there's an eclipse. It's once in a lifetime, but we are just figuring out, person to person to person, we need our special glasses. And that special glasses is a conversation. It's the nudge to the politician, the business owner, small business owner, who just connected the dots and said, my goodness, I cannot keep my doors open because I don't have staff, and most of my staff have children and they don't have childcare. And those connections are not easy to notice, but we, the community, have to do our due diligence, because we acknowledge, the advocates acknowledge, that President Biden, these very upper echelon politicians who do have the authority to make these changes, are listening. So let's make the most of it. That's my challenge of why it's unique.
Okay, accepted. So Meryl, I'm going to ask you to respond to my challenge to Eva, and to see if you think that it's if we're in a unique space. And I want you to talk about this space that we are nationally, but more specifically about Connecticut. And Eva kind of gave us a broad view of the crisis. And you have been in the trenches doing this work through the Connecticut Early Childhood Alliance since 2002, well before, again, these conversations are occurring. And so can you respond to my challenge to Eva, but also speak specifically about what are some of the things that are happening in Connecticut?
Sure. Really, there have been 3 times in this country when we have come close to implementing universal childcare. The first was during World War II, where we actually did have a strong system supporting women in the workforce, supporting the war effort. The second time was during the feminist awakening in the 70s, when we got within a presidential veto of transformative legislation. And then the third was with Build Back Better, where essentially it was the votes of Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema who prevented this from coming into place. In each of those times, there was a crisis in the labor market. The first was the shortage of men working in factories that were needed to support the war effort. The second was the large influx of women coming into the workforce who needed childcare in the 70s. And then during the pandemic, the shutdown of the economy, the disruption of things, people not being at work, and how that impacted childcare businesses who either didn't have staff or didn't have customers. And so each time that we have it's risen to national prominence has been a disruption in the labor market. Now, it's a shame that we haven't just looked at this and said, early childhood is a particularly key time in a child's development. And, we spend a lot of money on the K-12 system, but we really need to start earlier and have the public support to make sure that all children get what they need in their early years.
Mhm.
We haven't been able to transform the debate to children. It's still all about the labor market. So it's about childcare to enable people to work, as opposed to quality early care and education to help children thrive.
Mhm.
So you wanted me to talk about Connecticut. I got involved way back in 2002 when I had a small child, and we had been looking for infant toddler care. I didn't know it at the time, but I was in New Britain, which had the distinction of only having one licensed spot for every 11 babies under age 3. And so we couldn't find licensed childcare, even though we could afford to pay for it. We ended up having to go out of town. So that's my initial experience with childcare. It's not a whole lot better than it was then. We have statewide enough licensed infant toddler care for those children under age 3 for about 1 in 3 babies.
Mm.
And that varies substantially across the state, based primarily on income levels in communities. Most of a disproportionate share of the licensed infant toddler care is in wealthy suburbs where families are able to afford 20 grand a year for childcare, or more. And in poorer communities, where parents can't afford to pay those market rates, we're dependent on childcare subsidies or public programs to support infant toddler care. We don't have very much of that subsidized care.
Mhm.
And that leaves lots of families struggling to figure out, how do I go back to work because I need to be able to pay the rent? And there's a lot of relying on informal care, on family members, etc. And people doing things like mom works first shift, dad works second shift, kind of things to be able to piece together care, so that because they can't afford to pay for it in the market.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
So, within all of that, because the financial pressure on parents to pay for care, the people who are really subsidizing the system it's not the government, it's the people working in the child care field for less money than they really deserve.
Mhm.
If you look at the, equally credentialed staff in an early care program and a public school, you will see that the public school staff are making a lot more than the people in early care. And, we all know that public school teachers are underpaid compared to the rest of the economy. So that is the fact that we are basing a system on parents paying for care when they are really at their lowest net worth, is a fundamental flaw in our system.
And we talk about the fact that childcare, the crisis is really evolving out of these policies and legislation that seeks to punish people of color. And it sounds like the more things changes, the more it stays the same. We're talking about the evolution of this system. And what I'm still hearing you say, Meryl, is that wealthy white mothers have access to care, while low income, predominantly Black and brown mothers are still doing some of the things that they did during the time of the pioneers and during the time of World War II. Because prior to World War II, there were mothers in the workforce. And the system only responded when white mothers came into the workforce. And so there are Black and brown mothers, Native American mothers, whose children were being cared for in the same manner that you're suggesting here. We're in New Haven, and New Haven is categorized as a childcare desert. So can you talk to folks about what a childcare desert is, and why in particular New Haven is categorized as a childcare desert, even though there are lots of wonderful childcare facilities in the city?
Well, childcare desert is fundamentally a place where there isn't enough childcare to serve the children who need childcare.
Mhm.
And it's, I can't remember the exact definition as far as the percentage of children who go unserved to make it a desert, but it's it's basically about there not being enough care. And the primary reason why I'd say there are two reasons we have childcare deserts in Connecticut. In some places, it's because there isn't the density of children to be able to support childcare centers. If you look
Mhm.
out in the more rural Eastern Connecticut areas, there just aren't that many population centers that have enough kids that could support a childcare center. So in those cases, family childcare is sort of the only option because there's not enough kids to support the center. And in other places, it's because parents don't have the money to pay the tuition at childcare centers. And so in those cases, they are relying on, if they're lucky enough to get a subsidy, and really only about 1 in 5 income eligible families in Connecticut get the Care for Kids childcare subsidy, or they're lucky enough to get one of the precious few subsidized infant toddler slots or subsidized preschool slots.
So you talk about parents having access to subsidy, and I know this is work that you guys have done and have been working on. And um, if Eva, if you don't mind talking about specifically the crisis in the Care for Kids subsidy, and what were some of the legislative work and action that was taken this year to address some of the issues that were raised just now?
The Care for Kids subsidy, just to give a quick overview for any of the listeners who are new to the term of the Care for Kids program, is a program that allows with state and federal funding to pay a portion, not 100%, a portion of the parent or family member's cost for childcare for that child. The problem that we have with subsidy programs like Care for Kids is every single session, every single year, there is a decision that has to be made as to how much money the state of Connecticut will decide to put into this subsidy program. And based on that amount of money, it will then decide how many parents actually are allowed to use it. Unfortunately, time and time again, there's never enough money to really cover everyone who qualifies for the subsidy, which leaves many, 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 many family members on a waiting list that could be up to 9 months long, just waiting for their child to be paid into a child care program, and that could be home based or a child care center. Now, more recently, bringing us to this session, the waiting list, according to the state of Connecticut, was 7 weeks long. At the max, it was 7 weeks. Reported by providers and reported by parents to us and other advocates, we were still hearing that some of the waiting list times could run well beyond the 7 weeks and can hit you into 6 months, 7 months, or the 9 months. The other unfortunate part of this legislative session and this Care for Kids subsidy was that the waiting list was not 10 people or 15 people. The waiting list was way over 1,500 children. So that means that anywhere in the state of Connecticut and you qualified, your paperwork was in, you are for sure someone who is struggling and you're holding on to make sure you keep your job, you want to go to work, and all you need to feel rest assured is your child being in this Care for Kids program because you need childcare to work, but you're on that waiting list despite the fact that you qualify, despite the fact that you need your job, despite the fact that there should be enough money to fund the program. So the state of Connecticut, every single budget year, it is a struggling battle where advocates like Miss Georgia and Mr. Merrill here go to the Capitol and they say, hey guys, things are really bad right now. We know so many parents who really need support and family members. And by the way, childcare providers who are providing that education don't get paid on time. That's another problem. And with the demands of advocates and people testifying and reminding legislators that this is the right thing to do, well, they filled in that gap this year to bring down that waiting list to ensure that the 1,500 plus people, children waiting, hopefully will be, dwindled down to zero. The additional problem, so that's good news. There was money put into the system to meet that crisis, 18.8 million additional dollars, which that's fantastic. But the bad news is every single time we do our jobs well as advocates to convince legislators and elected officials that the Care for Kids program should allow more parents, if it's not combined with additional funding, the waiting list will just continue. So we're plugging a hole, we're plugging a gap, and we're doing it year to year without really creating a long-term solution. And that long-term solution really comes to play when we have real conversations about funding with the state of Connecticut and also the federal government. So if the feds were to match more money, then that's less of a burden on the state of Connecticut and our budget to expand programs like Care for Kids, but we can't depend on that. So it's this tug of war. It's this tug of war of what is a smart priority, what is the right thing to do, and unfortunately, parents are always stuck in the middle with their children. Family members are the ones who suffer while we're figuring this out.
So Meryl, before you jump in to answer this question, Eva, you mentioned that there is that disconnect between what the Office of Early Childhood, which is a state agency that manages the early care system, and what providers like myself are saying on the ground. And so I want to give just an understanding, because we were recently in a meeting with Commissioner Beth Bai, who described the system. So I want to describe that system for our audience right now for how a parent goes through the Care for Kids process. So a parent who applies for the program, their application is received by United Way, who is the subcontractor managing the Care for Kids system. It's received and it's held for review. That review may take about a month to a month and a half. Let's say best case scenario, it takes a month. Upon reviewing that application, so let's imagine a parent submitted their application in January. Upon reviewing that application, the United Way determines that this family is in fact eligible for the Care for Kids program, and then they're placed on a waiting list. Right? And so once they're placed on a waiting list, best case scenario, they may remain on that waiting list. Let's take the Office of Early Child Education's word and say it's 7 weeks. All right. So we're looking at roughly about 2 months that the families are sitting on the waiting list. So they've applied in January, they were deemed eligible, they went on the waiting list, they're sitting there for 2 months. So in total, a parent is now waiting 3 months to be removed from the waiting list. Upon being removed from the waiting list, that parent's application is deemed eligible because they have it's been too long in between the initial time that they applied to the time that it's being renewed. So that parent now has to reapply to the program again. And in all fairness to the Office of Early Childhood, they're just following the federal mandate, right? Which is that an application has to be within 2 months of its review and approval. So then that parent applies once again. And if that parent is on top of their game and they apply right away, then there's another 30 to 45 day review process that application has to go through. And so now if we were to think about a parent who applied in January, they're now looking at 4 to 5 months as a starting point, waiting list process, and a review process in order for them to be issued a certificate. So that is the reality on the ground. As a childcare provider, that is what we're seeing, and that is the discrepancy. So the families may very well be on the waiting list for 7 weeks, but the entire process from start to finish is not a 7-week process.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so we just want to make that very clear so that when people are saying it's 7 weeks, it's 7 weeks, it's 7 weeks on the waiting list, but we are talking about going through the entire process between 5 to 6 months. Now imagine a working parent who has a job offer and is ready to go into the workforce. They are one of the incredibly lucky ones to find an infant spot that's available. And they now apply for the Care for Kids program. They will have to pay in on average, it's about $400 a week in New Haven for infant toddler care. They would have to come up with $400 a week to pay so that they can enter into the workforce until that Care for Kids certificate is approved. And therein lies the problem, and therein lies the real issue with how low income families of color continue to be disproportionately impacted and disenfranchised and marginalized from high quality care. So Meryl, again, you have been steeped in this work. So can you talk about, again, some of the legislative actions that have occurred in addition to Care for Kids that have occurred in this legislative process to kind of help with that problem?
So one of the things that we worked on this year, the Coalition, the Alliance, Connected Voices for Children, lots of other organizations, was about establishing an ongoing fund so that we don't have these annual battles for the crumbs, which is really what we've been fighting for all these years. And when you think about the constituency of people who care about early childhood, they are primarily young families with children versus the other constituencies, like, let's say, higher ed. Well, they've got all those professors, they've got all of those college students. It's a lot easier to get college students to show up at the Capitol to protest tuition increases than it is to get babies to show up at the Capitol to call for more funding for early childhood. So we have traditionally lost out in the fight over priorities. And so that got much worse in 2017 when the state, facing a fiscal crisis, could not pass a state budget until October. And the price of getting a budget passed was instituting some of the strictest financial constraints on any state government that exist in the country. We have a spending cap, we have a bonding cap, we have something called a revenue cap that doesn't let us spend all the money that we anticipate to receive, and we have the volatility cap, which makes it hard to spend the money that rich people pay in taxes. This state is home to both very poor families and some of the richest people on the planet. And yet the tax system, those super rich people pay taxes through capital gains at a lower rate than people who are paying income tax. And we've set up the system so that even if we increase the rate of taxation on the richest people, we can't spend it because it's impacted by the volatility cap and it will only be used to pay down debt. So we've tied our hands as far as having the money to make it possible to support a quality early childhood system. That's one of our big challenges. So this year we made a small step in the right direction. We created a non-lapsing fund. It is still, there's not a revenue stream for it yet. So it's, if one of those rich people decided to give us a bunch of money, it could go into that fund. The next step is really to dedicate some funding to it so that there is a pot of money that can only be used for early care and education.
So what I hear you saying, Meryl, is that the state of Connecticut basically that has a wealth of resources in terms of some of its residents and their wealth, even if, and we currently see this, there's tons of money coming into the state, but our hands are pretty much tied because we're basically saying we're only going to pay down debt. And so it's as if we have a household, we have a family with a household, and they have a high credit card debt. And they made a pact that says, you know what, we're going to have to get fiscally responsible and pay down our credit card debt. And then they made a plan to pay down their credit card debt. But the car has broken down and there is a leak in the roof, and they're making additional money, and they're making a lot of money, but they are holding fast to the fact that I know there's water coming into the house from the leak in the roof, and I know we no longer have a car, but we're going to take this extra money and we're only going to focus on paying down the debt. So you're saying that those are the choices that Connecticut is making.
Yeah.
And so while the house is basically being deteriorated by the water damage, and you're figuring out all these different ways to try to get to work to earn money, you are getting all this money in, but you're only focusing on paying down the credit card debt. Nobody would do that in their normal budget, but you're saying that's what the state of Connecticut is doing.
Yep. We have decided we're going to pay off the mortgage early, and we are doing that while the kids are going hungry. That's basically, we made that decision. We created a strict set of fiscal controls that were locked in place with when we sold bonds, we put that into the bond covenant, so that the process of changing that would require the governor to declare a state of emergency and both chambers of the legislature to pass that by a supermajority. That's pretty hard to do.
Okay. So in a few minutes that we have left, I know that you guys were involved in some of the advisory work in the Blue Ribbon Panel. And this issue always highlights how marginalized communities and families remain marginalized in these policy decisions. So can you guys talk about how the Blue Ribbon Panel which was created by the governor to create a plan for the next 5 years to address some of the crisis. Clearly, they have even acknowledged that this is not a panacea for the entire crisis, and this is just a short-term fix to the immediate crisis. But again, we are seeing those racial disparities in childcare persistent, and it's fairly well entrenched. Can you talk about how the Blue Ribbon Panel in the next 5 years have discussed addressing those disparities, or if they did?
I'll kick us off on that one. The good news is that their 5-year plan does institute or request to institute changes that are necessary. Updates on the website to make it easier for parents to access childcare, find childcare, and really connect with providers. Updates for the educators, the owner-operators who have licensed care locations to help bill, pay, navigate the Care for Kids subsidy. There's also phases in their plan that allows for more funding into the childcare subsidy program, Care for Kids. There's also phases in the plan that acknowledge the federal recommendation of capping the cost of care for a parent or a family member to 7% of their annual income. So all of those suggestions are positive. The con, right, that's the pro. The cons here that I would call out is that their plan is not long-term. It is a beginning, right? These phases are trying to fix some of the problems that we all identify exist in the system, but it's not an overhaul of something that's already broken. The other observation is that their cap of 7% following the federal recommendation brings the cost, brings the minimum. Well, I don't know how to explain this in layman's terms. There's something that's called a state medium index, an SMI for short. And I guess the Cliff Notes version of what is an SMI, it's a fancy way to say, hey, you make a certain amount of money, and because you make that amount of money, you'll qualify or you won't qualify for certain programs. So on one token, they're saying we want to cap the cost of care to 7% of your annual income. But on the other token, they also want to say, but you can't make too much money because then you won't qualify for that.
Mm-hmm.
So it to me, and I'll just say my opinion. I won't insert my coalition into this conversation for right now because it's very tedious. In my opinion, it's very frustrating to hear a plan that is not that you're not basing transformation in the forefront. It's very frustrating because if legislators, the governor, the commissioner wants to truly tackle the essence of what the Blue Ribbon Panel was created to fix childcare, then you have to take a holistic approach. You have to take an aggressive long-term approach. And at the end of the day, you got to fund it. You got to fund it. You know, it is, to me, embarrassing that we took this very inspiring idea to do a Blue Ribbon Panel, to convene national experts on the subject matter, to tell us what is wrong, prove to us that we are correct as advocates, that what is wrong is actually wrong, and then say, let's do this plan and not fund it. So I'll put my coalition cap back on and say, as a coalition, what we have to do to motivate that change is to band together and remind the people in power who had that brilliant idea to have this convening that it's not too late to follow through. And I'll pass it over to Meryl on that one.
And Meryl, I want to speak though specifically to the issue of racial disparities and inequities in the system. So I hear you, Eva, and I think, a rising tide lifts all boat. And, from Circle's perspective, we take an approach that if you fix the system for the most marginalized, the reverberating impact will be that everybody will be supported in the system, right? If you look at the drug crisis in the 80s, if that issue had been addressed when the face of the drug crisis were Black and brown, then we would have been prepared as a country to address the opioid crisis when the racial demographic switched. So my thing is, if we don't look at the people who are the most impacted in the system and we just have broad policy prescriptions, then how do we then ensure that the people who have historically since the 1619 have been historically disenfranchised in a care system, then how can we then really ensure that the system will work for every single family going forward? And Meryl, as a white man, I'm going to ask you
Set me up there.
to speak to that issue.
So let me start off by saying that when you look at the recommendations that came out of the Blue Ribbon Panel, it was all about trying to get 20,000 women back into the workforce. It was not about transforming a system to assure that all children have access to high quality care. It was, what is the most efficient way to get us to the point where we can get more women into the workforce to relieve the workforce crisis that employers in Connecticut currently face? So the approach that was taken was to expand the Care for Kids childcare subsidy program, which currently has an income eligibility of 60% of state median income. So for a mom with a baby, that's $54,300. For a family of four, that's a little under $80,000 a year. That's the income limit. The Care for Kids program currently only takes 40% of the families who apply. The rest don't meet a qualification somehow. They don't have their paperwork in proving it, or they earn a little bit too much. They are looking for care when they're not at work, or their work activity isn't something that is considered eligible because it's going to college or something instead. So the proposal is that over 5 years, we would expand that to 100% of state median income. So for a mom with a kid, that's $90,000. For a family of four, it's $133,000. And every year that changes with inflation. But if you look at what you would pay as a family of four making $130,000 and what you would have to pay if you made $5,000 more and were over income, it's a giant leap from that 7% to the market rate. So there is that issue. That's not the primary problem facing families of color, because unfortunately in Connecticut, like the rest of the country, families of color tend to be concentrated at the lower end of the income stream for a whole bunch of racist reasons. So the question of how well do we serve the families at the lower end of the income stream, you can look at Care for Kids and say, oh, well, it's serving the lowest 60%, the 60% and below of income level. But what we know is it only serves 1 in 5 of those families because there's so many other administrative hoops and there's not enough funding to pay for it. If we were to clear out some of those administrative hoops that make it possible to ration care without saying we're rationing care, the wait list would go larger. That's where we're formally rationing care, is through how long the wait list is. And so, the plan called for ratcheting up spending to spend $600 million more than we spend now. The first year of that Blue Ribbon Panel plan called for spending $148 million more than we spent last year. The governor proposed $43 million, and what the legislature finally approved was about $20 million, all told. Really only $18 million more for Care for Kids. So we are at a very slow start towards even what was a relatively modest plan that was not about transforming the system. It was about getting more women into the workforce.
So we circle back to the beginning, which is that, again, the Blue Ribbon Panel appeared to exist to address the needs of the economy, getting women back into the workforce, not dealing specifically with the transformation of the early care system, and did not speak to the racial inequities and disparity, which, again, it speaks to the work that you guys have to do as advocates to make sure that we're centering these issues in the dialogue and in the discourse. So we have a few minutes later, and there were a couple other questions that I wanted to ask you, but I know we were going to probably go over. So in the next 2 minutes, I just want you to tell me, Meryl and Eva, if you had to choose one action to take that anyone can take, whether it's the governor, whether it's the legislature, whether it's a parent, or whether it's a provider, what is one action or one policy prescription that you would give to solve the problem? And I know this is, I'm being, tongue in cheek in this, but what's one policy prescription that you could provide, or one action that a person can take to solve the childcare issue or help to solve it?
I'll take it first. I'll take it first. I'll volunteer myself. The action from the elected official side, I think that's most appropriate, is creating a defined revenue source. And that's a fancy way of saying a permanent fund to pay for childcare. So for those who don't track policy, you know how elementary schools and just public schools in general have designated funds every single year that goes to maintain public schooling. Well, childcare needs them. So that's my request. That one thing, it's a big thing, but it's one thing I would request, demand out of politicians. And from the listener and the viewer who's just chiming in and wondering, how does this impact me? How does my kids are grown? well, childcare impacts the economy. Childcare impacts everyone around you. It is so rare that we don't have someone in our lives that has a child, and we were all children once. So my request to you, if you are, listening, is become part of the conversation. And that could be as simple as, joining. I got to put a plug for my coalition here, joining the coalition Childcare for Connecticut's Future. And that website is Childcare for CT, childcareforct.org, where we keep you up to date what's going on and how to get engaged, so we can guide you in that conversation.
So Meryl, thank you, Eva. In less than 1 minute, what's one policy prescription, or would you agree with Eva?
I would agree that it's about money, that there are, lots of ways in which you define how you spend that money and who gets that money. But we can't make the change that's needed without the resources.
Okay.
That's so, if you're somebody who's getting a candidate knocking on your door, ask them, so how do we fund childcare? Would you support creating a dedicated funding stream to support early care and education in the state?
All right. Thank you guys so very much. And I would just like to thank Tom Ficklin once again for allowing us this platform to talk about something that absolutely impacts every single person in the state. Thank you, Eva, and thank you, Meryl, for joining in this conversation. And Meryl, can you just basically give your website for your organization?
Sure. It's earlychildhoodalliance.org. Or
Right.
.com, sorry. We are in the process of changing it to a .org, but it's still stuck with earlychildhoodalliance.com.
As I got another rhyme, another rhythm for y'all to listen. I'm never quitting on my mission. I'ma roll with what I'm giving. Got some ambition, this new edition, filling positions. Looking at the void in myself and feeling what's missing. Better watch the way you going, better go in the right direction. In the moment you stressing, but you gon' be counting blessings. And I know that for certain. Keep on working, open curtains. Haters swerving, cause they ain't ready for your final version. Whoa. I'm never gonna give up. Fall down, I just gotta get up, yeah.
You're listening to the Tom Ficklin Show on WNHH LP 103.5 FM, your home for community radio.